Hello, welcome to Interdependent Study, our podcast where we engage in the learning and unlearning work for social justice and collective liberation. I'm Damien.
And I'm Aaron. Thank you for joining us today.
For those new to our podcast, Interdependent Study is meant to be a space and community for folks who believe in and want to do the work of social justice.
Each week we'll bring something new to the table, discuss our thoughts and feelings about it through the lenses of who we are and where we can go for a more just society.
Yes, sir. We want Interdependent Study to be a space where we're always learning with one another. And Aaron, you're up this week. What have you brought to the table today?
Yeah, I'm bringing Say Her Name, Black Women's Stories of Police Violence and Public Silence, which was written by Kimberlé Crenshaw and the African American Policy Forum. I said this last week, but this was very difficult to read.
Yes.
There were multiple moments where I was stopped in my tracks while reading this, and I had to put it down for a little bit just because the stories were so real.
Yes.
There are 6 chapters in this book that highlight different aspects and analysis of the issue of police violence against Black women, including an introduction and conclusion and an epilogue. The book touches on history of violence against Black women in the U.S. and what the Say Her Name network does to build community with the survivors in what they call the Mothers Network.
Right.
They talk about the toll that these deaths take on the families and the long-term health impacts. Chapter 5 is called In Memoriam, and it has a list of 210 women. 177 of whom were killed by police, and 33 of whom died in some form of custody. This is a book that I think asks us to bear witness to the ways that Black women experience police violence through the stories of 9 different Black women who were killed by police. The stories are told by mothers and or sisters who are left to make sense of the violence and take care of families and fight for the person who was murdered. And every single one of these stories gives us a glimpse into the person, who they were outside of the incident in which they were murdered.
Right.
You know, who were they? What did they love to do? What did they hope to do with their time on Earth? Had it not been cut short by police.
Yeah.
And before we move on with our conversation, I wanted to share the names of the women who have stories told throughout the beginning of each chapter.
Yes, please.
So it's Michelle Cusseau, Shelley Frey, Miriam Carey, India Kager, Corinne Gaines, Tanisha Anderson, Kayla Moore, Tatiana Jefferson, and Michelle Shirley. That's 9 lives cut short by consistent, endemic violence of our criminal punishment system that sees Black women as disposable.
Yeah.
And you know, make no mistake, if one group is seen as disposable, we can all be as disposable with just a few tweaks, a few minor adjustments to the machine. And so this is a thing for all of us to pay attention to and bear witness to.
Yeah. Well, first of all, thank you for that introduction. Thank you for that great introduction, actually, to this book and to our conversation today. I wondered how you do it. I didn't envy you for being the one to have to introduce this because there's obviously so much in this book. This was a tremendous book. Like, please don't get me wrong. It was a tremendous book. But, you know, as you sort of say, it also was just a difficult read because the content was just so heavy. And it was emotional. There were many times like you that I had to put this book down and walk away from it and sit in a lot of emotion in the midst of reading it. You know, I wish a book like this didn't have to exist for obvious reasons, but I'm so glad that it does. I'm grateful to know the stories of these Black women and the 9 Black women you mentioned in particular, and I'm so glad that their stories are out there in this way. And I love what you say there. If it can happen to these Black women, the criminal punishment system can do this to all of us. It can do this. And you tweak the system, you move the cogs in a certain way, and it really could be anyone. And so I think that's such an important piece of this that's so important to recognize and take away from a book like this. The fact that state violence can target any of us for any reason, really, and that's unacceptable. But I think this book is so incredible and important because it focuses on the stories of Black women. It centers their stories, and it centers these women in a way that the society hasn't, right? They've been left out of the conversation about police and state-sanctioned violence against Black people, against communities of color, against our society in general. To that point, there's a quote from the epilogue that I pulled. I'm sorry, the prologue that I pulled. That's the start. It says this, quote, "How does one begin a book on state violence? What words can capture the pain and anguish the loss of life inevitably engenders? How does one tell a story about the pain and anguish that is also a story about love, courage, community, resistance, and hope? And how does one capture the intersection of these stories in ways that center Black women in the ongoing efforts to make Black lives matter?" And I know that Kimberlé Crenshaw and her colleagues like really grappled with these questions, like grappled with the idea of like, can we even answer all of them? But I think this book definitely does answer these questions. And I think more importantly, it brings us all into, as readers, it brings us all into the imperative and the call for action to get to a place where this kind of violence hopefully one day ceases to exist.
Yeah. Yeah. And I think that they are, you talked about the way that the stories get left out. And I think that's the key reason why Say Her Name exists.
Yes.
The book, but also the movement.
Yes.
Is because these stories get left out of the media.
Yeah.
And we don't know them in the same way that we know the names of other people who have been taken by police.
Yeah, shamefully so.
Mm-hmm. So one thing I wanted to talk about for a little bit here was history, which is probably no surprise to anybody who's been listening to our show for
please
any time
do.
at all.
Yeah.
There are parallels to the way that the criminal punishment system sees Black women as disposable to the way that Black women have been treated throughout the history of the U.S.
Yes.
Authors reference Dorothy Roberts' conversation on Kimberlé Crenshaw's podcast, which is called Intersectionality Matters, where Roberts talks about and shows that, quote, "the routine and unchecked state punishment that Black women face today can be traced back to American slavery's earliest regimes of punishment and discipline." Roberts patiently laid out how the disregard for the family bonds of Black women, paired with the efforts to control their childbearing, form a punitive matrix of anti-Black racism that has targeted Black women for centuries.
Ooh.
And so I wanted to share this particular moment in the book because I think so much of how we operate today with policing and prisons and generally the punishment system connects back to enslavement. And I think we've talked about that on the show a few times. But, it's enslavement and then all of the ways that enslavement figured out how to control Black women and all Black people, and the way that system evolved into Jim Crow and then evolved into something else, evolved into our current iteration of the criminal punishment system. And I think we have to recognize that because if we don't, we'll repeat these same patterns that we can almost universally agree, with some few exceptions of some right-wing authoritarian governors, we can universally agree that these were despicable.
Yeah.
And if that was despicable, then we can see that the violence of policing today that takes the lives of 210 women over the last few decades is also despicable.
Yeah, absolutely. I'm so glad you brought that up. And I love that quote, this idea of what you said, punitive matrix. Like that you say, we've talked about this before, but it's important to talk about it in this context and the implication that it has and has had and continues to have on Black women in our country. And so the nexus, the place where we're talking about sort of the history of this violence continues today and continues to impact Black women and their families who are left behind. So, I think the connection that this book draws between this present day police and state violence against Black women to conditions, to treatment, to history, to violence against Black women throughout our time is such an important piece of the puzzle and such an important piece of this conversation, especially if, as you said, if we're truly committed to bearing witness to this struggle and to this violence. And that's what this book is, trying to get us to do, right?
Yeah.
And did for us, obviously. I think a related piece that stood out to me in this book is how it also addressed the ways in which Black women experience violence in the criminal punishment system and in other aspects of our society, right? I think that's such an important thing to draw attention to. So a quote I pulled was this. Contestations over police violence are not the only domain in which Black women can struggle for visibility and recognition. The marginalization of Black women's experiences extends to the wider dynamics of criminalization and punishment in the American justice system. For too long, critics of the carceral state have overlooked the disproportionate vulnerability of Black women and girls relative to other women. For example, in research data and policymaking that set out to document disproportionate vulnerability to policing, Black women are often airbrushed out of the picture. In the news media, stories about the racial impact of the war on drugs, the criminalization of poverty, and the school-to-prison pipeline frequently lack Black women. And so you started to make this point a little bit too. This is yet another critical piece of the conversation and the importance of the analysis of this book, to see the full picture and the full ways in which our society has neglected to tell the story of Black women, and our society has, and our systems and our structures have continuously punished Black women. And so centering Black women and others who are at the margins of our society is something we all need to recognize and do when we're having these conversations about the work that needs to happen. And so I think that's one of sort of the biggest takeaways for me when we're having these conversations, like, who are we talking about? Acknowledging everyone who's impacted by this.
Yeah, and I think one of the things that you said, I think we talk about a lot, broadly, it gets suggested a lot, of centering people who are on the margins.
Yeah.
And I think what that means to me, and at least in this moment, is that if these are experiences of people who are at the margins of the system, that means that the system is doing that to them, right? And
Yes.
so we have to understand what is happening there, because if that is a regular experience at the so-called margins,
Yeah.
we're going to ignore it in the middle.
Yes.
Where the center currently holds.
Right.
And so we have to understand what's happening at a different center of control So I think that's
No, that's such a good point, right? Because I also think it's a recognition that this is how the system is designed, and the system is doing exactly what it's designed to do. So I think that point is very valid. Yeah,
yeah. This is how it's supposed to operate, and you're not supposed to know that this is how it's supposed to operate because you're sitting in a different spot in the system.
But we have a book of 210.
Right.
Yeah.
Yes.
Examples of why that's the case.
Yeah. So I'm jumping forward quite a bit here, but I wanted to share this quote from the epilogue of the book, which just shows that the impact of this violence goes well beyond the person who was killed.
Yes.
So, quote, "In the aftermath of a police homicide, trauma wreaks havoc on the bodies of surviving mothers and across the families devastated by the loss of a daughter, a mother, or a sister. In the words of Valerie Carey, Miriam's sister, when they kill a Black woman, a daughter, a sister, a mother, the police dismantle a family with her death." And I pulled that because this dismantling of a family with her death calls back to the way that Black families have always been targeted by systems of oppression in the U.S. going back to enslavement. And this epilogue also shares how a few of the members of the Mothers Network have passed away over the last few years with health concerns that either stemmed or popped up a little bit after the death of their loved one.
Oh, that broken heart, yeah.
Or were exacerbated
Right.
by that. And so the secondhand violence, the secondhand toll of this violence is real. And I think it gets, exacerbated when that violence comes at the hand of a system that claims it's here to protect and serve us.
Yeah. It's exacerbated by that. It's also exacerbated by the fact that these women are also then fighting for information about what happened to their loved ones. They're fighting a system that doesn't care to defend them, and a system that doesn't care to tell their story and to share the truth about what is happening at any stage of the sort of the criminal punishment system, in the way in which we're trying to seek justice for what happens. And so, like, that makes sense to me. Like, in any situation where you are just fighting and fighting and fighting.
Yeah, and I think that, yes, the fighting is there. And I think what you said was that the system doesn't care to tell the story.
Yeah.
And I think it's actually not that. I think the system cares to obfuscate the story.
Yeah.
and make it invisible as much as possible,
Yeah.
or find ways to blame the victim
Right.
for what happened to them. And we see that in the story of Corinne Gaines and all of the women who I named earlier, all of their stories, there's some element of the police trying to figure out a way to tell the story, and then the media just parroting that from the police.
Absolutely. That's a great point. I appreciate you for sharing that. It's such that quote in particular, I think is such like a gut-wrenching and powerful part of the epilogue. And you and I had a conversation off the mic on Friday. I've been racking my brain about how we talk about and share the stories of those women you just mentioned, right? Like how there are these 9 stories that are presented at the start of each of these chapters. And as you mentioned, they're written by family who's left behind, mothers, sisters, and I want to say their names again because we have to continue to say their names. Michelle Cusseau, Shelley Frey, Miriam Carey, India Kager, Corinne Gaines, Tanisha Anderson, Kayla Moore, Tatiana Jefferson, and Michelle Shirley. And this book is so powerful because, you know, these were Black women with full lives, with families and friends who loved them, who still love them, and they deserve to still be here living their lives. And so it was difficult to read those stories. Their stories were beautiful, but they were difficult to read. And, you know, we talked about this when I was telling you I was struggling with what do we share and how do we do this? Because there's no way, I think, we just don't have the time to share all 9 stories. But I thought we got to share one. I decided we've got to share one. And I just picked the first one. So that's the decision I made. So I want to share a brief snippet of Michelle Cusseau's story. Michelle was murdered by the police in Arizona during a mental health pickup call back in 2014. And this is what her mother shared about her. Quote, Michelle loved people. She loved life. She didn't attend the party. She was the party. She loved to travel, loved to be near water. She always gave back to others and just had such a beautiful soul. She was the youngest of 3 children, and you could tell at times she was the baby. Michelle has always been a mama's girl and always promised never to leave me. She was my support. She took care of me, and I took care of her. I can still see her smiling face. Michelle was a lovable child, a lovable person, and as she grew into womanhood, she became a go-to type of person. In her circle of friends and in our family, everyone would go to her for advice. She would always have very good advice for her friends and family. I was her friend. She was my friend. We laughed and talked together, cried. She would call at least a few times a day to ask me how I was doing. And there's a lot more. I mean, each of the stories that these folks who were left behind shares, like 3, 4, 5 pages each easily. Yeah, because it's also not just about who they are, but it's about what happened to them in sort of additional context. But I think what this did for me, or what this provided to me, was just this context of a life well lived in all of these cases, and the fact that, not that I need a reminding of this, but these Black women's lives mattered. They mattered. And so I would encourage everyone to get this book and read these stories because they're so moving, so powerful. When I'm long gone, I want someone to talk about me in this beautiful way. And again, not to say that it's not difficult to read this and to understand this, but these women mattered, and it matters that we talk about them and what happened to them.
Yeah, absolutely. I think that the stories made the book all the more powerful.
Yes.
Because I think like the book could exist without the stories.
Absolutely. It could.
And there are probably plenty of books that exist like it without those stories. But these stories changed the relationship to the analysis it's also present.
Absolutely. That's a great point. It sort of connected those pieces. Yeah, or just made the analysis so much more powerful. Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah. All right. Well, let's talk about application. How does this book apply to our day-to-day lives? My application comes from the conclusion of the book where they say, quote, what I want you to understand as well is that when you read the mothers and sisters' accounts of their loved ones' lives, their passions and loves, their commitment to their own children, their mothers and siblings, you are honoring their 2 short lives that were and the lives that should have been. You are enacting the imperative of the Say Her Name campaign to bear witness to unspeakable tragedies and to stand in solidarity with survivors' search for justice. There's a lot of injustice around us that we don't hear because it gets buried or we're deliberately misinformed about it. And bearing witness to the tragedy as a practice keeps us aware of how much violence is just baked into so much of the systems that run the United States.
Oh, yeah.
And if we don't know that violence exists, then we will never change it. And it makes me think of the James Baldwin quote, "Not everything that is faced can be changed, but nothing can be changed until it is faced."
Not you bringing James Baldwin into the conversation. I love it.
So that's my application for the week. We can't change anything until we face it. And so we have to bear witness to all these stories, because if we don't, there's no chance to change any of it.
Absolutely. I love that. And I loved every bit of the conclusion chapter because that bearing witness work is so difficult, but it's necessary, to your point. It's the only way that's going to lead us to the changes we need to see in this society in which we live. And so my application is about that. It also connects to what you shared. It's a quote from the conclusion chapter that says what I want to say way better than I could. So here's the quote. Say Her Name must continue, and subsequent iterations will continue to support the mothers and families of Black women murdered by police, continue to address the multiple traumas that overwhelm the communities police killings leave in their wake, and continue to bear witness to the multiple dynamics that create the disproportionate risks that Black women's police encounters will be both lethal and invisible to the public at large. We bear witness to make our collective vulnerability legible, which in turn directs our advocacy to the conditions that must change for us to survive. We listen to and retell the stories we have heard, reckoning with the proximate causes of stolen lives and the broader structural forces that compromise those lives and render them vulnerable to state-sanctioned violence. We hold space for the mutual recognition, support, and permissions that only women who have experienced this particular loss can fully understand and give to one another. Mm-hmm. And so for me, that's why this bearing witness to this violence is so important. As you said, it's how we continue to recognize the ways in which this violence is, I love that, baked into every aspect of our society. And we have to recognize it. We have to see it. We have to call it out, and we have to fight it at every step of the way and stay focused in this work. So this book. Yeah.
All right, well, let's talk about homework.
Okay.
What are we going to do to continue to learn about this beyond our conversation today? There's a lot to continue to learn here.
Absolutely.
We can and should bear witness to the stories of the 210 women who are shared with us in Chapter 5. I think continuing to learn from the African American Policy Forum and the Mothers Network is an important way to continue to learn about the police violence that Black women face. And I want to go back and learn more from Dorothy Roberts, both in that podcast episode that's mentioned in the book that I mentioned earlier, and from other things that she's written, because she's got a long bibliography.
Absolutely. Yeah, that's a good point. I hadn't thought about that. Kimberlé Crenshaw's podcast, I think we need to add that to our rotation. That's some really good homework. Yeah, I definitely want to take the time to learn more about those 210 stories. Like, I don't think there's any more important work than that in the commitment to this. There's also about 15 pages of references in this book, which is just, those pages are full of additional opportunities to continue learning about this police and state-sanctioned violence. And so I want to check out some of the many, many links that are in that reference chapter for my homework as well. So yeah, just continue learning about these women and their stories, and just continue learning in general. Yeah.
Great stuff for continuing to learn so we can face this.
Yeah.
All right. Well, I think that's it for this week.
Yes.
And Damien, you're up next time. So what are you bringing to the table in our next episode?
Yeah. So for next week, I'm bringing an article that actually I should say is really a conversation to the table for us to talk about. The piece is called "Insecurity is a Feature, Not a Bug of Capitalism, but it can spark resistance." And it was written by the author's name. I might butcher his last name. C.J. I don't know how to say that. What do you think?
Polychronio?
Chronio? Polychronio. It's published earlier this very week on Truth Out's website. So you can find it there and you can help us figure out how to pronounce CJ's name. CJ, when you listen to this, I'm so sorry. CJ is a political scientist, an economist, and journalist, and also a regular contributor to Truth Out. So this piece is a conversation between CJ and Astra Taylor, who we've talked about on this podcast before, co-founder of the Debt Collective, filmmaker, organizer. This conversation centers around Astra Taylor's new book, which is called The Age of Insecurity: Coming Together as Things Fall Apart. So I'm sure we're going to add that to our book list. Yeah. The conversation is all about this concept that she writes about, which is that capitalism is this insecurity-producing machine that has an impact on all of us. And Astra believes that it could help us in our fight for radical change and collective liberation. It obviously can hurt us, but if we sort of understand this concept, mobilize around it, it could really aid us in our fight for radical change. So I'm excited. I haven't read any of it, so I have no idea how their conversation goes, but I'm excited to read it, to learn from them, and for us to talk about this in our next episode.
Yeah, I think if you think about just the title, Insecurity as a Feature, Not a Bug of Capitalism, it's so true, because what are all of the ways that we are insecure in this economic system?
Yes.
That we then have to go fight for security in some form or fashion for ourselves. Housing, food, healthcare, all of that is something that you have to go out and earn, when in reality we should probably have that as a right for people who, just because they exist.
Yes.
And that's the way that you survive.
Right.
So, yeah, looking forward to that.
Should be good.
Great.
Yeah.
All right. Well, that's it for this week. For real this time. So with that, we want to thank you for joining us today and for listening to Interdependent Study. You know what I'm going to ask you to do here, but in case you forgot, please follow, leave a rating and review, share our podcast with the people in your life, follow us on social media, check us out on YouTube and TikTok. Sign up for our email list to get notified about any new things we've got going on behind the scenes.
Yes, thank you so much for listening. And remember, it's not about us, but it is about us. And we'll talk to you next time.